Well, thank you very much. I would want to just start by telling you how much I count this to be a great privilege because really this is the very first time that I've been able to meet with the mission board and explain what we're doing and why we're doing it and how the connection is with the I will say IRB. What I mean by that is the Reformed churches in Brazil, and I'm just using the Portuguese letters, so the IRB. And I this is the very first time, and otherwise it's all been just by emails and so forth. But there's never been any real exchange with the mission board asking for input or information. So this is a really special privilege for my wife and I to be here. Lucille is also very much involved with the IRTC. She's our treasurer and does quite a bit of administrative work and plus helping me out. And I should add that although there were perhaps 3 occasions in which the IRB could have asked to meet with me or invited me to, because that I was in that area, could have talked to him, but I did not receive any such invitation. So just want to just express thanks for this special opportunity. My presentation is meant to be about 1 hour long. I hope that's not too long, and I hope I don't abuse my privilege and keep going on and on. And I should say also, not only am I blind, but I often, when speaking, do confuse terms unintentionally, not even realizing that I'm messing things up. So I really need your help tonight. The only way I can work with notes is by putting it up so that everyone can help me. We've got a PowerPoint. We've got all the points there. You can tell me what the next point is, or you can correct me if I skipped over something. Nathan will also kind of try to help things out. But let's work on it together. We are the International Reformed Theological College, an online college that teaches in Portuguese for anyone who speaks Portuguese anywhere in the world that may have access to the internet. So that's who we are, that's what we're doing, and we have been doing it for 19 years. Although the planning was for 2 years beforehand, so the planning started in 98, 2 years before Reverend Wiska arrived. You will know that, of course, that he was my successor there on the field. Let me just tell you in summary what my purpose here is. Tonight in this presentation, I want to do 3 things. The first thing I want to do is to convince you, I don't know if you will be convinced, but that's what I want to do, to convince you that the IRTC plan was a good solution for the IRB and still is a good solution for the IRB. The second thing I'd like to do is remind you that the mission board supported the IRTC in 2004, supported us financially, and it would be very important if you could support us again. And the third thing is that you would at least be able to call attention to our work in your communications with the churches. In the same way as is done from time to time for the Puritan Project, the conferences that the Puritan Project promote. These are not projects of the mission board or of the IRB, and yet you call attention to these projects. In the same way, we are not directly associated with the IRB anymore, but if you could at least just be kind of an instrument of calling attention to the work we're doing and encouraging people to support us. So that's what I'd like to achieve tonight, and the main thing would be just to convince you that the IRTC has a very helpful, good place for theological education in Brazil. Let me, basically, I'm just kind of dividing things into three parts. So the first part is the history and what is our background. And then the second part is the advantages of what the IRTC is doing and can do. And then in the third part will be a bit of a summary and also just giving an overview of what we are currently doing and what we want to do in the future. And so we'll just start with the history. The history goes back to 1998. Okay, so at this point, the IRB were not yet instituted or organized as a federation. And in 98, a conference was held in Unai, and that conference kind of was, for the first time, to bring all representatives from all of the churches together, and also in that way to, as it were, prepare for the first founding synod, which was held in July 2000. And one of the items on the agenda in 1998 was a proposal that came from the church in Colombo to appoint a committee, and the mandate for that committee would be to organize a program of theological training, or I've got it on the PowerPoint. What does it say exactly?
To organize a training program for students of theology.
Okay. Did I jump over anything in the
First slide is personal background. Reformed Church of Brazil, IRB. Other churches.
Okay, so let's go back there. Okay, so what I would like to do is just provide a setting in terms of the historical setting, and I just picked out the year 2000 because that's when the IRB came together as one federation, and that was also when the initial steps were taken for theological education. And the setting, what was the first point? The IRB? Is that? Oh, the personal. Yes, let's. Okay, I've never done this before, talking about my personal situation, but I just want to call attention to a few points that really are very relevant to this whole situation. What is the background for why and how we came with the plan that we did? So in my studies, just starting with my seminary training, first at Westminster Seminary, and then at the Theological College in Hamilton, my studies always, whenever I had an opportunity, I tried to learn about evangelism. So I took some 3 courses in evangelism. So that was a focus that I had. I had never had a focus on foreign missions. But an interesting thing happened, actually. After I was finished at the Theological College in Hamilton, I made a visit to Philadelphia, and I was approached by an OPC missionary, Orthodox Presbyterian missionary, Reverend Bruce Hunt, who was a long-time missionary in Korea. He himself actually grew up in Korea as part of a missionary family. Uh, and he said that he would, if at all possible, he wanted me to try to make contacts with the Canadian Reformed churches, that I would be sent out as a missionary on behalf of the Canadian Reformed churches to work in Korea. Uh, and he said, here's my concern. The Dutch Vrijgemaakte Kerken are just pouring money into this seminary in Korea. And it is really hurting. This seminary doesn't really need support, but they're asking for support. So the Dutch are very happy with this connection, and they're giving all this support. But what is really happening in reality is that this seminary is wanting to have a whole complex of buildings and everything that can compare with seminaries of other Presbyterian churches. And that's what's really happening. But what happens at the same time is this hurts the churches, whereas the church life has been very vibrant because the churches themselves are active. The national churches, and of course in Korea you were already talking about hundreds of thousands of members in those churches. And they were very strong, spiritually strong, good, faithful churches. And what happens is they now are developing a new dependency situation which they really don't need. And we have always worked with, and then he told me about the Nevius method. John L. Nevius was a Presbyterian missionary in Manchuria in the second half of the 1800s. And he had really worked on developing missionary methods that would not let the national churches become dependent on the foreign churches and the foreign missionaries. And that led to much more vibrant growth, and he himself believed, Bruce Hunt did, as did most of the missionaries, that the reason why, or one of the main reasons why there was just a really big spontaneous growth of Christianity in Korea was because of this method, avoiding creating dependency situations. That's kind of well, I could add just a little bit more in terms of my own background. I did my master's thesis at Westminster, and the topic of that was the relationship between the cultural mandate and the gospel mandate, the Great Commission. So already working with that theme again. And then in 1988, 89, so after 10 years in Brazil, I had a 1-year unpaid leave of absence for study. And I was enrolled at the university in South Africa doing a doctorate in missions and working with David Bosch. And with that, I was really introduced with the power of distance education. We just looked it up. Today, the University of South Africa, UNISA, is a university that only works with distance education, and they are the largest in all of Africa, and they have over 400,000 students doing courses of all kinds and at doctoral level. And this, they started back in, what was it, 1890 or something like that? 87, okay, yeah. So a school that's been doing distance education for a long time and very successfully. So that opened my eyes to the importance of using distance education, how great, an important tool that can be. Uh, so with that background, and then the background of already having worked in Brazil for, by that time, it was 21 years that I was in Brazil. I worked with the mission board, your mission board, for 20 years, was retired, remained there in Brazil to keep on working at a much reduced rate because of my vision problems. So now the next step would be the IRB. So the situation in the IRB at that time was that there were 5 churches. 3 were instituted, and the total membership would, well, certainly have been less than 500, probably less than 400. I imagine it was maybe around 300 or 350. Total membership, 5 churches. So that's important to keep things in balance. Of course, a lot has happened in between. Much more is going on there now. The Lord has continued to bless, and things are really developing. But that was the situation at that time. At that time, the churches had very little contact with other Reformed movements in Brazil. But then that's my next point, I guess, the Presbyterian churches. Yeah, so the other churches. So in the other churches, let's just start with the Presbyterian Church of Brazil. And actually, there are say, 4 Presbyterian denominations. But the main one is the, we'll call it the IPB. That's the Presbyterian Church of Brazil. Started in the 1850s by soundly Orthodox Reformed missionaries from the Southern Presbyterian Church in the United States. To give you an idea of what their perspective was, the church magazine that they started at that time was called the Brazil Puritan, or the Puritan Brazil. And this was at a time, actually, when Protestants were not allowed to have any church buildings. They had to just meet in homes. So that was kind of the background. And so now, of course, this church has 1 million members. It's a very large church. It's a church with a great deal of variety in it. It has swung from one doctrinal general direction to another throughout the years. And at this year 2000 or so, it would be good to say that it was mainly just evangelical, conservative evangelical, but not specifically Reformed, and open to a lot of charismatic material. But there was always a small but expressive Reformed group within the Presbyterian Church of Brazil. Now, that's been really growing, but there were there was always this faithful Reformed group within the church. Besides the Presbyterians, you had the Baptists. When they started out, were Reformed Baptists when they began in the 1800s. And there, if you add up all the different Baptist churches, you'd have probably about twice as many as Presbyterians. And they did have also a Reformed movement within their ranks. Then you have the Assemblies of God, maybe twice as large as the Presbyterians and Baptists put together. So the Assemblies of God were at that time the largest Protestant church in Brazil. And they have, as you've probably heard from your missionaries too, that they have a significant Reformed grouping within them and not really supported by the churches as such, or the leadership of the churches as such. But Adriano, for example, is someone that came from that background, and that's yeah. Let me just jump onto these different projects. You've all heard about the Puritan Project. The Puritan Project started in 1990, around about that time. Uh, an American missionary and Augustus Nicodemus and Dr. Manuel Canuto were kind of the start of this Puritan project, and a project that wanted to really push the reform perspectives. And of course, you're familiar with it because the IRB missionaries are working with it, and the IRB churches are working with it. Uh, and but I should mention that was um something that was definitely started without influence from the IRB. Uh, so that was started because there was this Reformation thinking. However, we should add that 20 years before that, there was this American Baptist missionary working in the Amazon who uh, read some books from the Banner of Truth Trust and became a Reformed Baptist. And he began a real ministry that was characterized as faithful. That was the term that what he called it. And they published good, sound doctrinal books, not an emphasis on adult baptism as such, more the emphasis on Puritan and Reformed. They brought in speakers from the United States. So the Puritan Project actually kind of copied what this organization had already been doing for 20 years. This organization is continuing very strong. They have conferences throughout Brazil, I think something like 4 or 5 per year. But their main conference is one they hold in October each year, not too far from Sao Paulo, and they limit their attendance to 2,000 people. Who so they're always filled up, and they bring Reformed speakers from England, from the United States, and then they have their own Brazilian speakers as well, and just Reformed men. So this was actually the movement that stirred up, because they work a lot with Presbyterians too. They're not strictly Baptist, and this was what stirred up quite a few Presbyterians too to get back to their roots. So this was a significant movement happening well before the Puritan Project started. This was a movement that is more for all of Brazil, but with a strong support in southern Brazil, whereas the Puritan Project is really a northeastern project. Both doing just great work. Besides these two projects, there is another publisher who kind of was part of Martin Lloyd-Jones's church, and he is publishing Reformed books. Then the publishing arm of the Presbyterian Church of Brazil. Okay, I mentioned already they have about 1 million members. I could also add they have 9 seminaries. Their publishing arm now publishes really only Reformed books. Many good books, including Calvin's Institutes and Calvin's commentaries, and just working on these projects. And That's kind of the, yeah,
26 minutes.
okay,
Start at the IRTC.
and a long way to go. Okay, please be patient with me. So that's the setting. Okay, so that was just wanted to give you the setting of what was happening. So then in 1998, yeah,
Do you want me to introduce this slide so that you
okay,
can
yeah,
focus?
yeah. Just keep moving the slides as needed.
Oh, then I'll go too fast.
So you need them faster,
Your control box.
faster than I can deliver.
The points are IRB committee mandate is to organize a training program for students of theology. Challenges are financial, manpower, distance, serving students, helping adults.
Okay, we'll pause there for a minute. So we have this committee then. I'm on this committee, but I should say I actually did not support this proposal. And my reason was in the experience that I had had with the IRB, none of their committees were functioning. So they would appoint committees, and none of them were actually reporting and having organized meetings and so on. So things were still not running very well in the churches. So I felt for them to then take on a theological education committee and project, it was something that would be an enormous challenge. Anyway, they wanted it, and they wanted me on the committee together with Reverend Seatsma from the South. So we looked at it, okay, what can we do that would really meet the needs at this time? The problem was the first students we had were studying at the seminary in Recife of the Presbyterian Church, and I had, and Reverend Mayer, we had taught some courses there, but that was at a time when that seminary was known to be the most reformed seminary in Brazil. But by the year 2000, there was a new leadership, and it was not academically very good anymore, and also was very vague on doctrine and not very reliable. So we couldn't recommend that seminary anymore. Uh, and actually, there were some students in Colombo and the south, where the work of the Asan mission, who had studied at an evening seminary that was Baptist and non-reformed. So these were really not answers. So what were the challenges? Uh, Financial was, of course, the first challenge. The thing you need to always watch, if you want a church to really not develop dependency, you want a church to mature, you need to have the church use its own resources and use the support from foreign churches very judiciously. It has to be done in a way that doesn't create dependence. So what we had to come up with would be a proposal that would not overburden the IRB. Otherwise, the churches would be hurt. Uh, Even hurt in terms of if the foreign churches pay all the expenses. That's one of the best ways to hurt a church. Do it all for them. Uh, Now, the next point was manpower. So how are we going to come up with a good proposal? The mission board at that time had, for the last 10 years, made very clear to Reverend Mayer and myself that we're not ready to expand our budget. We're not ready to expand to a third missionary. We're not ready to do those things that you think would be good to do. So we had a real strong understanding that we could not expect the mission board to be expanding at that time. So how do you then go about doing a theological education? Uh, so that was a serious concern. The next concern was that our students, our potential students, were men that were elders and otherwise leaders in their local churches. They were important men there who would be leading worship services and Bible studies and so on. They would be reading sermons and things like that. Uh, so if you would somehow put them into a brick and mortar seminary in one particular location, you're drawing them out of the churches. You're moving them away from the churches. That is an immediate step for the churches to have less strength. The leadership, you're moving them out. Now, you might say, okay, that's temporary, but there's other further complications with that, because when you do that, yes, it is temporary. The churches do have a temporary pause where they stop growing. But then when they come back, or if they come back, then you're dealing with problems of, these men are not part of us anymore. They think they're so much above us. That's what the kind of thing the church members say. Those kind of things can happen. Those are the things that we've been warned about in all the mission studies. Be careful. You're going to create situations of jealousy and envy. These students, they get all the help, and the local people are left behind. So these students, the best thing for them is for them to just keep helping the local churches. The emphasis needs to be on local churches. And that then, in terms of, I've also been covering that final point really about when helping hurts. So this is, the mission literature is full of this advice about how to not create dependence. And so that was something that was uppermost in our minds when we wanted to come up with a proposal. So let me just give the proposal that we came with. It was a plan, and remember our mandate. Our mandate is to organize. Our mandate wasn't to come with a proposal that the Senate could then adopt or not adopt, but we were already under commission to organize training. So that's where we looked at it and we said, okay, one option is to work with distance education. And the way to make that work is work together with other faithful Reformed Brazilians. The advantage of that is we're working with the same people we've gotten to know, because with the Puritan Project and so forth, let's work with those people and others that they can nominate to us and indicate to us, here, this is a reliable man, here's a reliable man. So we're not working with the Presbyterian Church as such, but just working with faithful men in those churches. And what you're doing then at the same time is you're addressing the needs of a much greater student population, not just 3 or 4 students of the IRB, and where you can also have the expectation that at some years you're not going to have any students at all, and so what do you have? You've got a whole brick and mortar setup, but no students. So these are all matters that you could expect to happen. So if you work with distance education and you're helping to teach students all over Brazil, and here's a big need in Brazil. The country is very large. It's not the size of Canada, but not all that far from the grouping of the United States and Canada. It's smaller, but still very large. And uh, you've got the Amazon region, no seminary there. You've got big areas of we just call it the outback. No seminaries there, and a lot of people and churches who do not have the means to move to one of the seminaries in the big cities. So we can help to address that need. And so I got together with, uh, through different contacts, through the Puritan Project, and so with 5 other men who were educators and scholars, and we started to work on distance education. They were very keen on it because they saw a great need beyond the needs of the IRB. So we could combine forces and reach also different groups. Uh, and the result would be that, so we proposed that or this was a plan actually that we were expected to put into place, a plan where uh, one option would be the uh, online training, and the other option, so for any student, we know that online training really isn't for everybody. So in a situation where you've got particular students that just need a brick and mortar classroom situation, there was now in Sao Paulo a really sound Reformed seminary. And that's even now, after 20 years, it's still a very sound seminary with men all from schools like the Reformed Theological Seminary in Jackson, Mississippi, doctors from or from Westminster or from uh, Greenville Presbyterian Seminary or from the Reformed Theological Presbyterian Seminary. Actually, so our students are really from similar groups, and these kind of men were already teaching in this seminary in Sao Paulo. So we proposed that the IRTC, uh, sorry, the IRB, okay, the Reformed Church in Brazil that our mission works with, that they would have, as it were, 2 study centers. Now, study center should be really understood as a very modest thing, uh, something where you just use a room in one of the church buildings, a room where you just bring together some of these students who are then working uh, online and get help from, and then 2 mentors. So there'd be a study center in the Northeast, and where students from the churches of the Northeast would come into the study center uh, several days a week and then be able to go back to their churches and help with the ministry of the churches on Sundays, and anyway, to kind of keep that continuity of the students working with the churches. And so we would, these 2 centers would each be under the responsibility of the IRB, or their own classes. We had proposal for 2 classes at that time, and so each classes would be responsible for that, and then they would ask for help from the foreign churches, but if as soon as they would be able to, they would have their own ministers working on this. And I'll get back to that when I show how the thing actually is currently working and what the advantages are. Um,
Discussions with Theological College in Amazon
yeah,
fully.
Okay, so just to give this picture there of what was happening in the year 2000, I met with the faculty of the Theological College in Hamilton. Uh, we were trying to work out some kind of affiliation with the IRTC, and the faculty was very receptive, but they said, okay, well, we can't make any decision because we don't yet have a decision from an actual synod of the Reformed churches in Brazil, so we'll wait for that decision. And that's where it went. Okay, just
First official IRP Synod, July 2000.
okay. So that synod was held in July 2000. I was not present. We moved out of Brazil at the beginning of July, or was it June? Anyway, so just a month before the synod took place. And that was fine because the other pastors and so on would take over and continue the work. Now, our report had been there already at to the churches a half year ahead of time. It was well prepared. We also had lots of contact with the councils of the churches and just keep getting feedback from them, and we addressed that all in our plan. But what happened with regard to our plan, we don't know. The synod took no action. That is to say, when you go through the acts, I wasn't present, so I don't know exactly how any discussion may have gone, but when you go through the acts, you'll just see nothing. You'll just see that the report was there. I think what probably happened was this synod was so involved with adopting the church order, going through each article of the church order, and working out all of these constitutional type things that they just couldn't get to everything. I think that's kind of how things happen, but not altogether. And I can just simply say the new missionaries were coming with new ideas, namely that we had to have brick and mortar and so on, and that's kind of, and how I can show that in terms of in October of that year, let me just say that the IRTC went ahead anyway because the 5 other members said, well, this ministry is so important, let's keep going, let's just develop it, even if the IRB do not make use of it. So that's kind of the direction we took.
American Conference of Reformed Mission Workers until October 2000.
So,
Organizational meeting.
yeah. Okay. So actually, the sequence was that we did organize first, and the Latin American Conference was after that. I should give you a quick summary here of every 3 years, the Latin American missionaries and mission aid workers all got together in a conference. So one time it would be in Curitiba, another time in Curaçao, another time in Suriname, another time in San Jose, Maragogi, and Recife. We all took turns. Every 3 years, we had, let's say, workshops. And so, and I don't know if there have been any since Maceió. I just really don't know. But at Maceió, we were already trying to integrate with the ICRC, International Conference of Reformed Churches, and trying to involve all of the contacts at the ICRC, contact churches. And so in Maceió, we had quite a number of representatives from different churches. And I was there because I had been asked to be a speaker, and the main theme was distance education. And I was there with actually working as a team with Dr. Paulo Anglada. He recently died, but he was a very crucial man in the beginnings of the IRTC, taught many of our courses, and he also taught at the John Calvin Institute later, as I did too at a certain point at the ad hoc training, which was kind of like a precursor for the John Calvin Institute. So we were very interested in still cooperating. Uh, and so he was there together with me, together with Dr. Mauro Meister, so two Brazilians and myself. We presented our plans and demonstrated how online education would work. And that was well received and well supported. There was a lot of interest at the conference for that because we had actually had this as our theme already for the last probably three, four Latin American missionary conferences. We were constantly working on this theme of how do you work in a way to bring churches to maturity without creating dependency. So that was fine. And then immediately after this conference, we had a working conference of just the Brazilian Reformed churches. And that was just a 1 day or 2 day conference after the 3 or 4 day Latin American Missionary Conference. At that conference, Reverend Whiskey made a proposal for a brick and mortar seminary. They would use three local ministers of the Presbyterian Church of Brazil to be teachers. That was a proposal he had then in the year 2000. And he was putting this up to get input from the other churches, the other mission works. And the Dutch churches were there, especially the men of the Verenasten, let's say the region beyond neighbors. So really the mission aid of the Dutch churches. And they responded and said, do not do this. And here's the reason. Do not start brick and mortar seminaries that are all dependent on foreign missionaries. Here's why. We have done it 3 times in different parts of Indonesia and somewhere else. I don't remember where the other seminary was. And they said 2 of them eventually died out because it was something that came from the foreign church. It really hurt the churches in terms of creating bad relationships among ministers and the members of the churches because the foreign missionaries were drawing national ministers to be educators at the seminary, and they thought themselves kind of more privileged than the other ministers, and so on. It wasn't something that came from the churches. So don't do it. Don't make the same mistakes we made. So that I'll just close on that. That's the situation it was at that time.
Part 2, advantages of the IRTC and distance ed.
Okay, so
Needs addressed.
part 2. All right, what are the needs addressed?
Needs of small churches, such as the IRB. Needs of churches and students throughout Brazil. International needs, Mozambique, Portugal, Japan, and foreign missionaries.
Okay, so here's what the IRTC is doing, so you can compare what we're doing and what distance education in general is doing and can do. You help small churches like the IRB. They can't have their own seminary. They really don't have the means usually when you try to help a foreign church, like a national church, get set up with something, you work it out with a plan that they can take over in 5 years and perhaps in 10 years. Then it should be transferred. Otherwise, it isn't their own. They don't make it their own, and you've created a situation of dependence where they sit back. They don't do the work. They let the missionaries do the work for them, and they want to be receiving more and more of this. Uh, so a small church can't do that, but we can help. Uh, then there's also what I already mentioned, all over Brazil, students that would be interested, but they can't because of economic situation, because of local church situations. They can't move to a brick and mortar seminary in the large cities. Then, of course, with distant education, not only can you reach Brazilians, but you can reach men everywhere in the world. We have currently more than 10 students in Mozambique. We have had one student in Portugal, and we now have one teacher in Portugal, and we expect that we can get more students from Portugal. We have we now have really only one, but we've had two students in Japan because there's a significant group of Portuguese-speaking people in Japan. Then we have various missionaries from the Presbyterian Church of Brazil who have missionary training but don't have good, sound, complete theological training. So we have men in one in Iraq, another one in Albania, another one in Italy. We have one in India. Those are all studying with us, so we're able to help those men as well. Okay, that's
Advantage number two, good stewardship of human resources.
okay.
Our qualified instructors to be fun.
So by distance education, you can bring together some of the best instructors. So what we have currently is we have instructors, two in the Netherlands, one in Canada, Reverend Van Spronsen, and one of the ones in the Netherlands is Reverend Meyer. And we have four in the United States, myself and three Brazilians who are now living in the United States, have studied in the United States. They have master's degrees and are working on doctorates. And then the other instructors are all in Brazil, but again, you couldn't bring this kind of a quality staff together into one place, but you can do it with distance education. You can bring them together into one school, and all of the students all over the world can get help from this group of highly qualified instructors.
Good stewardship of finances. No buildings, no transportation costs, adjunct instructors, and annual budget of $130,000.
Okay, so these points are self-explanatory. Let me just mention adjunct instructors. We don't have any full-time instructors, so we just bring in instructors who teach one course, two courses, maybe four courses at the most. Most teach just one or two. So these men don't get the same kind of salary where you have a full-time worker. So it's financially beneficial that way. Next point.
Faithful reform instruction. Board and instructors.
Okay, yes. So we've been very selective in terms of who we work with. So they all the board members and the faculty all subscribe. We follow the model of the International Conference of Reformed Churches. Either subscribe to the three forms of unity or subscribe to the Westminster Standards. But we actually, pardon me? Or both, but that seldom happens. each will say, yes, but I really prefer the three forms of unity, or the other way. Uh, so it seldom happens that you really embrace both, but our subscription uh, form that they sign or that they agree to is really a form that says, and recognize the other group of confessions as soundly reformed. So they are supposed to agree with that. And they do. We've had just very selective uh, recommendations from men that we trusted, who then were able to recommend other trusted men. Uh, and so among our board members, in the original board, we had Reverend Cornelius Van Spronsen and Reverend Mayer. We had one of the founders of the Puritan Project, and two other men of confidence. One was a former student of mine at the Presbyterian Seminary in Recife. And since then, uh, we've, among our board members, we've had uh, two more who were involved with the Puritan Project. We've also had, we now have Julius Van Spronsen as well. And we try to get a balance between uh, ordained ministers and elders. So kind of a balance between that, as well as a balance between Presbyterian background or like Presbyterian Reformed background or Continental Reformed background. Uh, yeah.
We're approaching 1 hour, and I can read the other advantages.
Okay. Yeah.
Qualified instructors, 30 instructors, 6 with doctorates, 21 with advanced masters, 3 with advanced MDiv, and most teach in their area of specialization. Should we go on to the next slide?
Well, let me just mention that by advanced masters, I mean another master's degree beyond the Master of Divinity. And then the Master of Divinity instructors we have, I think maybe 3, are men that already have, just through experience and other studies and so on, they're actually beyond a Master of Divinity.
Another advantage is interactive and personal, where you use forums, messages and tests, and video conferences.
So it might seem counterintuitive, but distance education is actually very interactive. Uh, we have various instruments where, like a forum, for example, or other, in any way, we require the students to express themselves in the forum, and then other students are supposed to respond, the instructor is supposed to respond. Uh, when a student, for example, sends a message, the instructor has to answer that message, so the student gets a personal response. Uh, and then we do also have video conferencing. Now, not all of our classes are video conferences, but we try to more and more get each class to have 1 or 2 video conferencing sessions. Video conferencing has a good benefit in terms of you have some good interactivity in real time, but you're dealing with students in all these different time zones. It's very hard to get them all together. But also, uh, when students are preparing for their exam or so, what's more important for them is to be able to go back and just read the actual lesson that was originally prepared. Everything is there for them, and that's very helpful. Uh,
And church supervision.
Okay, so now here's a real advantage. Don't miss this out. Our plan really is supposed to work, and I say supposed to because many churches are not doing that. But the IRB could very much do it. You can get good face-to-face interaction with the plan that we are working on. The way we do this is uh, we consider that the actual work of responsibility for student training is the responsibility of local churches. Or, you can bring them together in classes or so, but it's the church's responsibility. So what do? We help out the local churches. We provide academic teaching, but they must provide a tutor. Every student that studies with us needs a mentor from their local church. And that mentor then meets with the student regularly. That mentor has access to everything we provide for the students. The mentor can just look in, read the notes, read what the student is supposed to be working on, uh, follow his work, and then we also promote the idea of what we call local study centers. And that was the idea uh, that we're recommending for the IRB. They would have local study centers where you have one instead of two, three, four instructors. You have one member, so the churches only have to supply one for each study center. And that person works regularly with the students, knows what they're studying online, then has a weekly meeting with them, but generally it could even be more often. And they can give supplemental training. They can also provide, if the IRB wants to uh, give more specific training, especially to keep things doctrinally sound. If they think that they need correct anything that the distance education provides, they can do that. So the local churches have this interaction with the student, face-to-face interaction with the student. So this is an important part of what we do and what we encourage the churches to do. And this would work very well for the IRB if they would embrace it. And by embracing it, so really they have a center going already, but then they can make use of our teaching, and at the same time they can use some of their own materials and their own courses. They've already got a lot, so they can use that as well, and it can be thoroughly integrated and work very effectively. But one of the main things here is uh, one of the IRB pastors can himself become a mentor then. And there's no need for a foreign missionary to continue this work. And so it would be quite possible for the IRB to have full uh, full involvement for their training of their students within 10 years of when this all was started, which of course we're about 20 years further by now. And so that's where our whole plan was, and that certainly could have been done. Next.
Final advantage, study advantage, means self-explanatory as far as students do not need to leave home, flexible study time, students can serve their churches, learning in their own environment.
Okay, so I don't need to add to that. Let me just add one point that I didn't put in this outline. It's really important for good communication and good training to have uh, Brazilians teaching Brazilians, because they notice the culture, they know the culture, they notice what a student really is wanting to say, what a student really needs to hear. These are things foreigners can't really do well. So that's very important too.
Part 3, IRTC current situation. There are 65 students, different program options, complete course, programs, and administration is in place.
Okay, so we've made a lot of progress. Uh, we had to work slowly. We didn't have funding at all at first. The first instruction for about 3 or 4 years was all done volunteer. And then we now have 65 students. Uh, we really could have more, but there were some things that we're not doing well. One of them is that uh, our costs are a little bit higher than other distance education programs now in Brazil. 'Cause we were the first at the time, but now there are others out there. Uh, so we've had to adjust our prices, which we've just done. So we lost students because of that. We also lost students because the 5 men on the committee wanted our school to be founded in North America. We started in Brazil, but they thought it would be better to do it in North America, so that's why we're incorporated in North America and Virginia. But the problem is it's difficult to make international payments. In Brazil, you need an international credit card. They have national credit cards and international credit cards. National credit cards are less difficult to get than international ones. It's really a case of those who have money can do more. So that's been a problem too. So what we now want to work on also is to get an association in Brazil that can then also have an account there and therefore process payments and so on. So that's been a bit of a holdback. Very slowly, we have built up all of the courses we now need for our main program of studies, which is a program of studies of one bachelor degree that we call a Bachelor of Christian Studies. It consists of 40 courses, and one Master of Divinity degree that is a 3-year program of, in other words, 30 courses. And then we have variations of these programs using the same material, but for students who aren't planning to go into the pastorate, or students who, like some students, really only want to study theology to teach theology. And so we have variations, so that they have perhaps without Greek or Hebrew. These are men that aren't going to go into the pastorate, and they're women who really want this education more just for Sunday school teaching or other programs they're working on. Then we have those who just want to teach theology and therefore don't do the pastoral courses. And so we have the various options.
Future prospects and plans, potential for 1,000 students, Christian school teacher training, counseling certificates, and needs.
So in terms of future plans, we've got a lot of things in place. And then I say, well, potential for 1,000 students. Why do I say that? Well, on the one hand, the whole structure is in place, and then even if you had 1,000 students, you would only probably just double your budget. So for 65 students, going up to 1,000 students with just about double the budget, you can do that. So you become ever more efficient. But I say 1,000 students because there is this other distance education school, Miami International Theological Seminary, MINTS. They are teaching in Spanish, doing distance education through the various Latin American countries. They have thousands of students, 2,000 or 3,000 students. And these Protestant groups, evangelical groups, Reformed groups in Latin America are smaller than in Brazil. Brazil is just a very large country with a lot of people. So we do have that potential if we can more and more get things tuned in for such students to really look to us. Okay, that's so. Oh yeah, and then we are kind of also doing a study currently just to see whether we can get in or whether we should get into teacher training. uh, because the Christian school movement is really growing in Brazil. Um, there's a university there, Mackenzie University, associated with the Presbyterian Church. Uh, they have developed all kinds of a whole textbook series for Christian schools. Uh, there are thousands of schools using those textbooks. So there's a big potential there. We've got a lot of teachers who do not understand Christian worldview. And so perhaps we could help out in that area. Another area we are also looking at is biblical counseling. We actually have three instructors capable of teaching biblical counseling courses, and we have only one as part of our Master Divinity program, but with six courses, for example, we can provide a certificate where men are more specialized in biblical counseling. So that's one thing. So now let's look at the needs.
Additional 45,000 includes the new president, funding for library accreditation.
Okay, so this is kind of the situation we're in right now. Uh, we've been working at getting our staffing all in place, especially in view of the fact that we need a new president. Uh, the current president is slowing down. Uh, his memory isn't working all that well, and he's blind. So we need to move on. We need a new president. But to get to that point, we also need the rest of the structure. So we now have a vice president for student affairs, one for academic affairs. We have a registrar. We have an IT person. So we have been expanding our budget, and to meet our budget this year, we really need another 45,000 United States funds beyond what we were receiving last year. And it's not going to keep going up year by year with such jumps. This is just a large jump because last year some of the new people that came in only came in for about half of the year. So now we're looking at a full year. So there's a very significant jump. So that's one of the needs we have. And these are really needs for you to pray about. And as I mentioned already at the beginning, that the mission board and the Canadian Reformed churches could really get involved. Yeah. No. What was the need for? Okay, so we certainly would like to get to accreditation, but you can't get to accreditation without the proper library. We need to develop an online library, so that's still a great need. We need funding for that. We also actually need some funding for student aid, student assistance, because we have quite a few potential students who can't pay our full costs. So we don't now help them out. They just don't study with us because we just don't have the resources, but that's a need as well. And then, of course, there is a wish list. There would be all kinds of things, but one, for example, would be to have somebody who can develop videos for us to really promote the college better and so on. We have a lot of presence already on social media, Facebook and so forth, but our presence there could be more professional looking, more effective. So those are kind of like additional nice things to have. Okay.
IRTC and you, recapping the 3 points.
Okay, so now then just summarizing in terms of, okay, uh, what, how can you be involved, and where can we take it from here if you have been convinced, okay? So my main point was to convince you that, this was really the original um, program of theological training that was to be in place for the IRB, and it just simply wasn't acted on. But I wanted to convince you that this is a good proposal and that this proposal can still work very effectively. Uh, and then, yeah, the mission board did in 2004 provide part of our funding. That could be done again. And then if you could also just uh, tell people about who we are, that we are using men very similar to the men that the missionaries are working with. A number of them are the same men with the Puritan Project and so on. We are doing the same kinds of things that the John Calvin Institute is doing, but we're just doing it for many more students and with the potential of reaching many more students. Uh, so that's a summary of that part of it. Now, so please be in prayer for us. We've mentioned particular needs. Uh, we have an online website, so you can learn a lot more about us on that website. We also have all of our, well, most of our past newsletters. Each newsletter contains perspectives and information. Uh, then we have a regular newsletter. Actually, it'd be good if we can just have a piece of paper going around. If you would like to just receive our regular newsletters, all you have to do is add your email address. So we'll add that email address to our newsletter list. Um, every We've had a whole problem for 1 year already where one newsletter editor couldn't do the work anymore, and we've had difficulty getting a new editor in place. But everything, we just had a June newsletter, and if things go well in July, I'll send around a kind of an update of a personal letter, and then in August there will be another newsletter, and in September I'll just send another message. So once a month. Don't expect your inbox to really fill up, but so there's that promotion, and then anytime you have or any kinds of questions you'd still like to ask, um, I'm available at any time with the regular Canadian Reform Minister address, ralph.boersema@canrc.org. We also have other uh, kind of summary information things that even, for example, there's a thing about just describing the overall situation of the Reformation movement in Brazil, but also just kind of advantages of distance education and how do you really work it out? How do you do good training of preaching from a distance? Um, I teach one of those courses. I can tell you all about how we do it. Um, and getting there. Yes, so certainly, the IRTC Society is our Canadian partner group, and these brothers are here with us, John Raukema and Harold Ludwig and Kevin Van Delden, and I don't know if Jack Marison is here, and Nathan is here. These are all members of this society, so they coordinate the Canadian activities and fundraising. Uh, then, what more? That's it. Okay. Oh, yeah, and we do, I don't know, do we? We were going to have a printout of our catalog. So it's available here. Some of you might just want to leaf through it. You'll be surprised to see that we've got a very extensive catalog and everything. There's a lot of work that's gone into this on behalf of, on the part of many uh, qualified instructors and personnel.
Well, we're